In French philosopher Voltaire's essay on Universal History, the Manners and Spirit of Nations, published in 1756, he writes that the agglomeration, which was called and which still calls itself the Holy Roman Empire, was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Since Voltaire's humorous quip, the quote has been repeated constantly across history-oriented circles, both academic and otherwise. But it's not quite accurate. Rather, it seems to be a product of its time, and somewhat ignorant of the centuries of history the Holy Roman Empire had endured until Voltaire's day and age, wherein it seemed to be more of a crumbling relic of the past than a mighty resurgence of the Roman spirit. The Roman Empire now did not fall in a single moment. Some argue it didn't even fall at all in 476 AD with the deposition of Romulus Augustulus by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. After all, the Byzantine Empire in the east would live on for about 500 more years. But even when the legal polity of the Western Roman Empire truly fell, the idea of Rome did not vanish. Odoacer, recognizing the legitimacy of the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno, ruled Italy as a nominal viceroy. However, he was soon overthrown by Theodoric the Great, leader of the Ostrogoths, who had been sent by Zeno to reclaim Italy in the name of Constantinople. Theodoric, ruling from Ravenna, maintained much of the Roman legal and administrative system, employing Roman senators and preserving the structures of governance that had defined the Roman Empire, even though Theodoric's reign was the height of the Ostrogothic kingdom, a Germanic polity. Even by the late 400s AD, the Germanic kingdoms necessarily sought legitimacy through continuity with Rome. Theodoric's government preserved Roman law for Roman subjects and Gothic traditions for Germans. This model of dual governance would be a template for later Germanic rulers who would claim Rome's inheritance. In essence, Rome and her institutions continued during this time, simply under the oversight of Germanic rulers rather than a Roman emperor. Many of these Germans and Goths, who were already Christian, mind you, called themselves Roman because it was a mark of legitimacy, of civilization, and of power in the emerging European sense of the word. Around 535, the Byzantine Empire Justinian, seeking to restore imperial unity with the West, waged the Gothic War to reclaim Italy. Though his forces triumphed, the devastation left the peninsula vulnerable to the Lombards, who invaded in 568. The Lombard kingdom, like the Ostrogothic state before it, blended Roman administration with Germanic military aristocracy, even adopting the SPQR as a symbol of their rule. The Lombards ruled much of Italy for 2 centuries, yet even they adopted Latin for administrative purposes and issued edicts in the language based on the standards and traditions set by Roman law. In the north, the Frankish kingdom, founded by Clovis in the late 5th century, followed a similar path, though this occurred before the rise of the Lombards. Now, Clovis had converted to Catholic Christianity and adopted many of the Roman institutions, ensuring that his rule would be accepted by the Gallo-Roman population of what we now know to be France, but what was called at that time Gaul. The Merovingian dynasty continued this tradition, blending Roman and Frankish legal codes, while their Carolingian successors expanded this legacy. By the 8th century, the papacy, which had grown increasingly independent from the Eastern Roman Empire, turned to the Franks for protection. Pepin the Short, Charlemagne's father, deposed the last Merovingian king and secured papal legitimacy by defending the city of Rome against the Lombards. Pepin then drove the Lombards out of Italy, and then in 768, 3 years after his death, Charlemagne came to power in the Frankish Empire. By 800 AD, Charlemagne was crowned King of the Romans. With this coronation, the Roman Empire had returned, at least in spirit. Charlemagne's empire, though legally called the Roman Empire by its subjects, the papacy and foreigners alike, except for the Byzantines, was not a direct restoration of Rome, but it was a conscious revival of its ideals. Charlemagne centralized administration through a system of counts and missi dominici, kind of mirroring Roman provincial governance. His legal reforms drew from Theodosius and Justinian's legal traditions, preserving Roman jurisprudence. The Carolingian Renaissance, a cultural revival of Latin, ensured that Roman literature, philosophy, epic, and law were studied and disseminated throughout his land. Even though the Byzantine Empire, of course, saw Charlemagne's coronation as a usurpation and saw themselves as the true Romans, Charlemagne's empire, which over generations came to be known as the Holy Roman Empire, maintained Western Rome's legacy, much of Western Rome's territory, the lingua franca of Latin, Roman law, and the concept of an emperor as a divine and temporal ruler. Thus, we can find ourselves easily tracing a line from Western Rome through what might be called the Roman pretenders in these Germans, Goths, and Lombards who styled themselves as imperial Roman rulers, all the way to the coronation of Charlemagne and the revival of the Roman Empire through the Gallic peoples. It's certainly not as direct or as simple of a lineage as Eastern Rome or the Byzantine Empire can draw, but it is a lineage nonetheless. But there might have actually been an opportunity for Charlemagne to truly take his title Emperor of the Romans to its logical conclusion. At the time of Charlemagne's coronation on Christmas Day in St. Peter's Basilica, the Byzantine Empire was ruled by Empress Irene of Athens. Irene was a strong-willed and politically ambitious ruler, and she also had many enemies, as her rule was achieved through less than admirable means. Originally regent for her son Constantine VI, she had him deposed, blinded, and likely killed in 797, seizing sole control over the empire. This act horrified many, especially in the West, where it was seen as an unnatural power grab, including by the Pope in Rome. Pope Leo III refused to recognize her rule, arguing that a woman could not legitimately hold the imperial title, and thus the church's favor began to tilt towards the West and Charlemagne. Despite the tension that the coronation caused, though, it's been historically rumored that Charlemagne and Irene could have considered a marital alliance. If true, this could have quite possibly reunified the geographic Western and Eastern Roman empires, bringing Constantinople and Rome under a single ruler's protection for the first time in centuries. It was also somewhat mutually beneficial. Charlemagne would gain legitimacy as the true Roman emperor once the Byzantine elite aligned with him, and Irene could secure her tenuous rule with Charlemagne's powerful armies, which would also serve as a shield against the Abbasid Caliphate and the Bulgars. It has been suggested, though not necessarily by solid documentation, that Irene herself entertained the idea, but of course, it never truly occurred. That's because there were just as many, if not more, factors working against this union. For starters, Pope Leo III had crowned Charlemagne precisely because he saw Byzantium as illegitimate under Irene. A marriage would have forced the Pope to either acknowledge Irene or undermine his decision to crown Charlemagne and play politics even more, pointing at some new figure to crown emperor. Charlemagne was also content to govern his realm in Europe, and didn't necessarily harbor expansionist ambitions beyond simply consolidating his own realm and ensuring it was stable enough to transfer to his line. Irene, for her part, faced pretty constant opposition from her own court, particularly from her advisor Nikephoros, who, it is said, feared that this marriage would reduce Byzantine independence and strengthen her authority to make poor political decisions. He ultimately orchestrated a coup against her in October of 802, deposing and exiling her to the island of Lesbos. With Irene's fall, Nikephoros I took the Byzantine throne and ended any hope of a Carolingian-Byzantine union. Relations between the two emperors remained strained, as Byzantium never recognized Charlemagne's imperial title. They instead referred to him as King of the Franks. And Charlemagne's empire would not last long beyond his reign. His grandsons divided the realm in 843 under the Treaty of Verdun, giving rise to East and West Francia, which would, throughout the rest of European history, evolve into the German states and France. But what if all of that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, Charlemagne and Irene married and briefly reunited the Roman Empire? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help support our content, you can watch through our extensive catalog of videos, or consider supporting your legion, like our current channel members Eaglefall, Derek Arno, Wolfgang von Siefertberg, Stratocrat, Daniel Andrulis, and Lekness. Thank you, and enjoy the video. If we assume that somehow the marriage of Charlemagne and Empress Irene occurs in 802 without a hitch, and the powers of Europe make no effort to impede this action, the European order of the early medieval period would be completely changed. For the first time in centuries, the Roman Empire would be nominally restored under a diarchic system reminiscent of the Augustan tradition. Charlemagne, with his capital in Aachen, would take the role of senior emperor, overseeing the western territories, while Irene, ruling from Constantinople, would govern the eastern provinces as junior emperor. One of the immediate advantages of this union would be the access Irene would gain to Charlemagne's formidable military resources. The Abbasid Caliphate had exerted constant pressure on Byzantium, forcing Irene to pay tribute to maintain a fragile peace, and the Bulgars, under Khan Krum, posed a persistent threat in the Balkans. With Charlemagne's support, the new Roman Empire could, in theory, respond more forcefully to these challenges. However, the logistics of moving Frankish troops into Byzantine territory would pose a significant initial obstacle. Unfortunately, the Mediterranean would not be a reliable conduit for mass troop transport, given both the activities of pirates and the fact that the Abbasids were in control of Egypt and the Levant, and thus the sea was not a Roman lake. Overland movement through Illyria and the Balkans would be preferable, though it would require some military intervention by Charlemagne's forces to conquer this territory, and it would take some significant time. Thus, the movement of troops to the east to reinforce Byzantium would likely take several years. But once Frankish troops could establish themselves in the region, the balance of power would see a tilt. Given the distances and the necessity of securing supply lines, it is reasonable to assume that a force of 5,000 to 10,000 well-equipped Frankish troops could be sent eastward in the first year, though larger deployments would of course be delayed several months until this secure overland route could be established. Now, the presence of Frankish soldiers in Byzantine lands would undoubtedly introduce some form of tension, with the Byzantine elites likely seeing this as a barbarian occupation of their lands. Though the East-West schism had not yet occurred, theological and cultural differences between Latin and Greek Christians, as well as these Germanic Christians, were already very heavily apparent. Frankish warriors held the martial traditions of Western Europe, and were very often regarded by the East Romans as barbaric Celts who took over the West. Nonetheless, the Frankish soldiers would be a valuable reinforcement of additional Christian manpower against other Muslim and pagan threats to the north, east, and south, and the Byzantine elite would essentially be forced to work with the Frankish strategos to keep their borders secure. Charlemagne would likely continue his military expansions in Illyria over the next several years. This slow but steady advance would require constant constructions of coastal fortifications along the troop routes and subjugation of the local Slavic tribes, who, if not well appeased, might otherwise align with the Bulgars. These expansions would be tempered, however, by the introduction of Norse-Danish incursions from the north. The assassination of the Danish king Godfred in 810, as in our own timeline, would then immediately remove this Danish threat, meaning that these raids would really only be a distraction for a few years, but the uncertainty of the northern frontier would chip away at the prospect of a full military commitment to the east until the Frankish realm itself could be deemed secure by Charlemagne. To manage these various simultaneous military obligations, Charlemagne, himself much more privy to internal matters than military campaigns, would rely heavily on the administrative and military structures that had made his empire thus far effective. that being his system of levies and the banum, the king's right to call vassals and freemen to arms, which would ensure a steady supply of troops, while the palatium, his centralized royal court, would undoubtedly be tasked with individually coordinating military efforts in different regions of the empire. The palatium could be probably expanded to incorporate some of the Byzantine elite. It really did function as the central nervous system of the empire, overseeing domestic governance in the various reigns and keeping nobles with vested interests in the well-being of those regions there to administer and command troops, while also maintaining a constant flow of information that allowed the empire to react both in compartment and in a whole. So if the Byzantine elite could be successfully integrated, or at least made privy to information flows within the Palatium system, Charlemagne could compartmentalize the defense of his realm while still fulfilling his obligations to the east. Now, one thing that might make sense given the seeming reunification of the Roman Empire would be the moving of the western capital from Aachen to Rome, but I believe this much to be unlikely and impractical. First, Pope Leo III, who had crowned Charlemagne in part to counterbalance Byzantine influence, would not be pleased with this turn of events in Charlemagne's alignment with the East. He might put up barriers to a relocation of the capital to Rome, technically under papal jurisdiction at this point, simply because of this animosity. Now, Leo III was about on his deathbed, passing away in 816 AD, but his successor, Stephen IV, had an equal disdain for the Byzantines. But, much more importantly, Rome, at this point, was a shadow of its former self, with a population of only 30,000 to 40,000, much of it in ruins and struggling with encroaching swampland. Not only would it involve massive investment in order to reconstruct, likely in accordance with the wishes of the papacy, which might not be cheap, mind you, a relocation to Rome would be impractical and also perhaps alienate northerly regions of his domain, who might feel as though his gaze was turning to the Mediterranean instead of the Germanic homeland. Aachen, by contrast, was centrally located within Charlemagne's realm, making it a far more practical administrative hub. Instead of relocating the capital back to Rome, Charlemagne might perhaps invest in Rome's restoration as a symbolic gesture, perhaps even seeking to initiate a repopulation of the city to serve as a large Mediterranean base for the Franks. But even this much seems a bit like wishful thinking, given the economic situation of the Franks. Charlemagne was already continuing his father's efforts to standardize currency, because of the major issues of inflation that the Frankish Empire faced. He decreed a phasing out of devalued gold coinage in favor of a pure silver-based system. Now, just given the economic situation here, unless there is some major rebound, without the wealth that came from the 2 centuries of rising out of the feudal system that brought Europe back into the Renaissance of our history, around the time of Da Vinci, a restoration of Rome at this point, in what would be like the 800s AD, seems pretty improbable. But shifting gears a little bit, the economic changes would actually have an impact on the East, where the solidus had long been the standard currency. Now, it would make sense to standardize currency across both the East and West to this new silver currency, but that much would be a massive project that might also require a taxation of the rich Byzantine provinces like Venice to ensure economic stability. It's not out of the question, but it is tricky, although internal affairs was really where Charlemagne was an expert. His ongoing reforms in the West would continue throughout the Carolingian Renaissance, which might even bleed over into the East. Gallo-Romance, or medieval Latin, was to be more greatly standardized with Church Latin across the empire's educational institutions, and additionally, Charlemagne put pressure towards church reform in order to root out corruption and doctrinal disputes that had plagued the clergy. If we see this bleed over into the East, his push for stricter moral discipline and standardized liturgical practices could also have provoked resistance from the Byzantine ecclesiastical hierarchy. Now, by 811, Charlemagne's eldest sons had passed away, leaving only Louis the Fair, later known as Louis the Pious, as the sole heir to the empire. His transition to power would be overseen by Empress Irene, who would shape his governance style. Though he had already grown into a Frankish world, he would soon be immersed in the world of the East, and as a result, adopt certain Byzantine traditions, including the elimination of partible inheritance. As he was growing into his role as emperor-to-be, Irene faced domestic rebellions, Arab invasions, and a prolonged war with Bulgaria. The Byzantine military had suffered under decades of financial difficulties, but the arrival of Frankish reinforcements from Charlemagne's levied armies and client states would probably keep the balance of power in favor of the Romans. Frankish heavy cavalry with the disciplined Byzantine cataphracts would be an ultimately devastating force against particularly the Bulgars, who were pinned down on both flanks. By 815, the Roman Empire would have shattered Bulgarian resistance, forcing Khan Omar Tag into submission. The Arabs, too, faced a renewed Christian war effort. Given that the Abbasid faced internal rebellions and religious schisms, it would find itself unable to maintain the same level of pressure on Byzantine Anatolia, allowing Irene's forces to reclaim some of the cities lost in previous decades. Now, upon Irene's death, with no male heirs of her own, Louis the Pious would assume control over the entirety of the empire. Louis sought to reform the royal court, purging it of those he deemed morally corrupt. Arriving in Aachen, he would begin his reign by exiling select court officials and destroying Germanic pagan relics. However, his reign was quickly met with internal dissent, as regional governors and rival claimants challenged his authority. In 817, Louis, having barely survived the collapse of a wooden gallery in Aachen and facing his own mortality, issued the Ordinatio Imperii, a decree designed to issue a stable succession. His eldest son, Lothair, would thus be appointed co-emperor and given overlordship over his brothers, Pepin and Louis, who ruled Aquitaine and Bavaria, respectively. However, this arrangement excluded Bernard of Italy, who, feeling slighted, launched a rebellion. Louis would swiftly crush the uprising, capturing Bernard and ordering his binding, a punishment that would lead to Bernard's death. But this act would weigh heavily on Louis the Pious, leading to a period of religious penance in 822. During this time, Lothair would be sent to Constantinople to rule as junior emperor. There, Lothair was immersed in the Roman traditions, the history of their old empire, the languages of Greek, Latin, and Frankish, and Roman law, even more so than his father. His upbringing in Constantinople would shape his perception of rulership, not as a feudal overlord, but as a true Roman emperor, responsible for the unity and stability of his realm and his people. Upon Louis's death, Lothair I would ascend to the throne, swiftly exiling or neutralizing rival claimants to solidify his rule. Seeking to strengthen ties with the East, he would take a Byzantine wife and appoint his son Ludovicus II as junior emperor in Constantinople. Lothair's reign was mostly one of military reforms aimed at creating a permanent standardized army. He established enlistment quotas in towns and villages, equipping soldiers and guaranteeing them land upon retirement, drawing directly from the Roman tradition and creating a class of soldiers directly loyal to the emperor, not feudal lords. Lothair's centralization of military power threatened the nobility, leading to internal unrest. Some Franks and northern lords viewed his reforms as a betrayal of their culture, leading to a widespread northern insurrection. However, Lothair's well-trained and loyal army would quickly crush these rebellions, before the legions were then deployed against the Abbasid Caliphate in a bid to reclaim the Holy Land, which, for now, would not succeed. Following Lothair's death, a new threat from the north would emerge: Viking raids. By this point, Viking longships could reach as far south as the Mediterranean, targeting coastal settlements. The Norse also migrated into the Kievan Rus, establishing a presence that allowed them to attack the empire from multiple fronts. While not overwhelming in number, their mobility and unpredictability could perhaps force the empire to recess into a more feudal societal structure, at least upon the borderlands. Soldiers granted land for service would form a class of landowning warriors who could be mobilized quickly in times of crisis, receiving duties for service to villages and towns. Border regions of the empire, particularly in the north and the east, could likely adopt this administration, relying on the system for protection, while the imperial heartlands would maintain a more centralized administration and continue to re-evolve into a more Roman form of jurisdiction. While the Viking raids would be a pain, as the imperial borderlands adapted to defend against this perpetual threat, Ludovicus could turn his attention towards other issues. By the mid-9th century, the fragmentation of the Abbasid Caliphate would grant Rome an opportunity for imperial expansion. Roman forces would thus push into these fractured states, securing buffers in the Levant and Mesopotamia, likely aligning with the Armenians. We could see a conquest additionally of Egypt, aided by the suppressed but still fair in number Coptic Egyptians, which might allow Christian Europe to form a chokehold between Arabia and Africa. Once Egypt fell under Roman rule, Islamic expansion into North Africa could be quite clearly cut off, possibly leading to a gradual reconquest of this region. Now in Iberia, imperial forces would support the Christian kingdoms, the Galicians, Castilians, and Pamplonians, establishing these kingdoms as states stretching further to the south to challenge Muslim rule, which would already be cut off from Arabia and facing insurrection in Fez in Morocco. However, Rome would soon face an even greater adversary than the Muslims, that being the Mongol Empire. The Mongols had swept through Central Asia into the Kievan Rus and even into Mesopotamia, threatening Roman territories. While they would fail to breach Anatolia or the plurality of the Levant, Europe would enter what would essentially be a 200-year-long stalemate between the various Mongol hordes and the Roman emperors, with their allies in Iberia, Egypt, Germany, and Anatolia, with borders shifting relative to the strength and stability of each power at any given moment. Even as the Mongol force began to retreat, the Black Death would arrive, but with it would come a Roman Empire thrust into a new age of technology, new mercantile systems, and a world whose gates were opened wide to exploration. Throughout these late Middle Ages and early modern period, Rome would struggle with a constant tug of war between falling back upon feudal structures to maintain stability during times of turbulence and holding together a unified state and unified military to retain its power in the Roman tradition. The next chapter for Rome could very well be anywhere from division to expansion to even adventure overseas to great new and undiscovered lands. So let me know what you think will happen next. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.